Hey everyone, and welcome to the next lecture. What I want to do is take the opportunity to spend some time putting empathy and perspective taking as well as assertiveness into the context of leadership and influencing others / negotiation. So empathy and assertiveness are certainly good skills to have for well-being and wholehearted living during the course of every day. However, we're using those skills or using these skills as tools of influence, and that's what this class is about. So I want to take some time to talk about that a little bit. So earlier this week, I was doing some reading and came across a leader who basically said or made the observation that we always feel as though we have to be nice, that we have to please people, that we can't have any conflict or start any conflict. And it's his insight and belief that that's really very dangerous. It's very dangerous to relationship, and that there's a real danger to being nice. And something to give some consideration to, and to consider whether you actually believe that or agree with that. And nice in this context is defined as agreeable or pleasing. So certainly it's not intended to be that you shouldn't be kind to people, you shouldn't be respectful to people, but the question is whether or not you should be or can always be agreeable or pleasing, particularly in the context of any negotiation or situation where you're trying to influence. He goes on to say that we shouldn't attack each other personally, but we should have vigorous arguments, disagreements, discussions, debates about how is the best way to do things. But if everyone's just nice and sits around the table and says, oh, that sounds nice, you don't get world-class stuff. You don't accomplish excellence. And so if we put this in the context of, leadership and or negotiation, again, thinking about if you're sitting around the table negotiating and you're just agreeable all the time or pleasing, then the question is, are you getting the outcome that you desire, and are you getting outcomes in a negotiation that's better than your best alternative to a negotiated outcome? So it's in the context of sort of wrapping our heads around this and thinking about this that we start to consider our role as influencers. And so the question begs is, do you believe that there are scenarios in life that requires skills of influence if they're not necessarily agreeable or pleasing to the other side? Do you believe that there are times when you have the solution to a problem that is in the best interest of those whose minds you need to change? And so, we're shifting the mindset of negotiations from not really from collaboration, but from a negotiation where everybody's interests can be met, to a negotiation where the outcome still may be in the best interests of you as well as the best interest of the person you're negotiating with, but they don't necessarily see it that way. Their desire or their goal is something else. Another way to put it is, are there times that the solution you desire, which is getting something better than your best alternative, to not changing that person's mind, and that is also an outcome that is better than the other person's BATNA. And part of perspective taking and empathy is you are coming to that decision for them. So, there's a lot of bad negotiators out there. There's people out there that don't necessarily do a proper assessment of their BATNA. And you, as a negotiator, may have to do it for them. There was a time when I used to, in a negotiation, sorry, I was sitting down there for a minute. There are times in a negotiation in the past where if I was speaking to somebody and they were telling me, what their desired outcome was, what typically amount of money they needed, and then went on explaining why they came to this conclusion or how they developed that goal. Oftentimes, I wouldn't necessarily point out where they were wrong. I would not assert my client's interests or not assert my position, simply letting them move forward with perhaps false misconceptions about either their interests or their case, only to then perhaps end up at trial and having them find out that they were wrong when the jury comes back in favor of my client. And so that was more, how I approached things early on. But, similar to, if you think back to the story of the naval operations, with the fellow sitting in the lighthouse and the captain on the battleship, again, the situation of conflict could have been avoided if the fellow in the lighthouse had asserted his position, earlier on in sort of the negotiation, if you will. And so what I had to learn as I've developed over the years of practice is that I don't necessarily do anyone a favor by not asserting my interests. And so, think about it this way. I'm also an employer. If my employees can't come and speak to me about, feeling as though they need a raise, and that's true of you. If you don't feel like you can go to your employer and discuss a salary and discuss a raise, and instead avoid the whole concept and choose to let that linger and then leave an employment situation because, for greener grounds, you haven't influenced that situation. You may look at it from your perspective as an employee to say, oh, the employer can't afford to pay me. Or, oh, look at all the reasons why an employer can't meet your interests. But in the same right, if you're providing benefit to that employer, you're a good employee. You certainly believe that you would be entitled to a raise. You must have some, other than, you're there for a certain length of time, you must believe you convey some benefit to the employer. Then you're not only doing something that's in your best interest, you have to believe you're also doing something that's in the best interest of the employer. So they may not necessarily, be happy with you asking for a raise. However, depending upon how you do it, you can still be collaborative, if you will. You can still be respectful, but asserting yourself for a raise or, and negotiating for that may do them a favor if the alternative is they may lose a good employee. Because what you need to know, and certainly I've come to understand as an employer, that if we lose an employee for whatever reason, and that employee is a good employee, it's often hard to find a good, valuable replacement that fits in well. So there is value for an employer to keep good employees, and there's thus value for employees to assert their needs if the best alternative to a negotiated agreement is leaving that employment setting and going on to something else. So again, we're looking at things where you're evaluating and having to objectively come to a decision about what is the other side's BATNA and what is your BATNA, and then trying to fashion a result that meets both people's interests. So when we look at the, by definition, a negotiation can succeed only if the other side agrees to an outcome. And therefore, there might be times where you have to change the mind of someone who doesn't necessarily have the same interests or the same goal at collaboration, at least initially, that you have. So what if you cannot always be agreeable or pleasing in order to obtain an outcome that both exceeds your BATNA and still meets the significant interests of the other side? I'm not even sure what that word really is, if one tried to pronounce it, but it should be significant, obviously. So let's go back to something we examined early on in the beginning of the course. I've changed the title of it a bit, but it's Tactics to Create an Agreement, right? So you can have a war, you can have a hostile takeover, and even though it's not a real agreement, it's an agreement with somebody having, no other alternative. There's also a way to create agreement by just being overly aggressive, and we've all been probably the victims, or seen certainly someone being so aggressive that the other side certainly just gives in, and they get bullied into an agreement. Then there's manipulation, where one side employs influence that aims to change behavior, but it's oftentimes through abusive, deceptive, or even underhanded tactics. And some of the Cialdini, depending upon how they're employed and whether they're employed ethically or unethically, it could actually fall within manipulation. So the Cialdini textbook both allows you to use some of those skills. If you do it ethically, then they can still be skills of influence. They can be used against you as underhanded tactics, and even deceptive tactics. Or you could use them unethically as well. So again, one way to create an agreement is certainly through tactics of manipulation. And then what we try to emphasize is getting an agreement through influence, which is the act or power of producing an effect without apparent exertion of force or direct exercise of command. And it starts to getting people to believe what you believe, which is that your goal, that your interest is also something that meets their interest. So let's put this now in the Mandela article that we read. And so Mandela's negotiation produced a result that significantly met both sides' interests. But the word significant is just that. It's also, it's significant in and of itself. It didn't meet the interests of both sides totally, couldn't do that. But certainly Mandela produced a result that that met his interests, and it also met the prime interests of the other side, although the goal certainly was not, and the outcome certainly was not necessarily what the government was hoping for, certainly at the outset of the conflict. Now, interestingly enough, when you look at the Mandela article, and if you have time to go back and reread it, I would suggest it's something that you could go back and reread on a number of different occasions and still get something out of. But it's interesting when you look at the Mandela article that he clearly in his negotiation used tactics of war, and he used questionable ethics. And with respect to the questionable ethics, you know, he was having secret negotiations with the government and didn't tell you know, his fellow inmates and the people on his side of the movement that he was having these negotiations. And he had a number of meetings with them and certainly didn't tell the people and didn't tell even those within the same prison that he was in, confined for the same reasons, that these negotiations were ongoing. And you could question whether or not that was ethical, particularly when he was misrepresenting the situation. However, again, you know, I think there's perhaps justification for it. And certainly, again, he was seeking not to do anything that benefited himself. He was doing it for the benefit of both sides' interests. But, you know, also, you know, circling back to using tactics of war, you know, let's be mindful that the war metaphor, as Dan Cohen said, elevates tactics over substance. You can take a class in logic and argumentation. It magnifies the us versus them aspect of it. It makes it adversarial. It makes it polarizing. So, as the author of the Mandela article notes, in spite of questionable tactics, Mandela uncompromisingly advocated interests, convincingly addressed the other side's interests, helped shape an unattractive alternative to negotiations for the nationalist government, and consistently engaged in good negotiation practices with some tactics. So again, be mindful that despite the, you know, where most negotiators would say, you know, arguments of war aren't good negotiation tactics, and perhaps some of the unethical aspects of the negotiation aren't good negotiation tactics. They were necessary in Mandela's mind. Mandela understood that your negotiating power is fueled by the strength of your alternative to settlement, best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And so, you know, he escalated the concept of war and ongoing war to strengthen his position and the alternative that was available to the government should they not enter into a negotiation. And, you know, a very important aspect of what's stated in the article is that he realized that parties will negotiate when the outcome at the table will be better than the outcome away from the table. So, you know, that's a very important key to remember, is that if you have your interest and you know what your best alternative to a negotiated agreement is, and you stay true to that, sure, you take perspective, sure, you consider empathy, but that's not necessarily going to impact your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. You do that, and once you know what your best alternative to a negotiated agreement is, if you stay with that, right, then what you have to do is influence the other side, that they need to negotiate and that even though they may not get their own interest met entirely, it'll still be an outcome that's better than if there wasn't a negotiated outcome for them. And so creating change will occur when the need for change outweighs the status quo. And so what you're trying to do is influence the other side, again, ethically and with good negotiating tactics. You're trying to get the other side to recognize that the proposal that you're offering and could ultimately agree to is still better than the status quo for them, where the status quo represents their best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And although there's not a lot of time, and there was no time in this course, there is no time in this course really to talk too much about timing. You know, the Portnoy material that we looked at is kind of interesting because timing is a very important component to negotiations. You may find, you know, there's a lot of people out there that feel like they have to make a decision, and that decision has to be made today. And you can play off of that for people who feel compelled to make decisions, even if they know they might get a better deal tomorrow or next week or next month. They're motivated by getting a deal done. Meanwhile, sometimes you have to create a crisis, or you have to create an urgency in order to get people to move. Hence, you know, businesses have sales, right? So, you know, if you buy tomorrow, you can have, you know, this particular product for X price. You know, when we think about Black Friday, right? It's get the best deals, allegedly. Get the best deals on this day. You've got to go shopping that day. And if you don't, you won't get the same deals. Arguable whether that's true or not. But anyway, so, you know, there's a whole nother component of timing that has to be considered when we're talking about influencing and how to use timing in negotiations. But again, you know, mostly what we want to walk away from, at least, is knowing that, you know, you can influence a situation and create change by establishing that, you know, the need for change outweighs the status quo. And so when we look at Mandela, you know, I mean, he used arguments of war to his benefit, directly out of the article. Our resort to the armed struggle in 1960 with the formation of the military wing of the ANC was purely a defensive action, he said. He goes on to say the factors which necessitated the armed struggle still exist today. We have no option but to continue. So this declaration, or this declaration, was made on the day of his release, a week after President de Klerk met all of the ANC's preconditions for negotiations in his own monumental parliamentary speech known as the Unbanning Speech. So again, you know, when we think about timing, right, and the motive behind Mandela's statements of war, you know, I certainly believe that he was making sure to create some urgency. So even though they had discussed and President de Klerk had met the ANC's preconditions for moving forward with negotiations, Mandela still wants to heighten the urgency or maintain the urgency by which these negotiations need to proceed by using statements of war. So, you know, again, from my perspective, right, for me, statements of war or the concept of arguments of war is around the concept of litigation. And sometimes we have to press in litigation very hard so that individuals can start to realize that perhaps going to the table and negotiating at the table is a better, will find a better solution than pressing forward with litigation. So, and that's, again, and depending upon the situation that you're in, if you're an employer or a supervisor and you have to be punitive, again, you may have to use punitive responses, if you will, arguments of war, to get somebody to realize that behavior needs to be changed or improvements need to be sought. So, and that's true if you're talking about interactions between businesses when there's conflicts that occur. So there are times that arguments as war are still necessary. Hopefully it's not often, but it is something to at least recognize as a tactic sometimes has to be used. So, for Mandela, violence as a strategy, when you think about it, violence as a strategy is spurned by professional dispute resolvers. So to hear it advocated by one of the great peacemakers of our time was jarring, and that's again a conclusion right from the article itself. But yet, his use of a war argument, when you think about it, the author also notes that Mandela had the remarkable capacity to understand the other side's interests, to convince them, as he did, and to find ways to meet their interests. So, again, we're talking about all the skills of influence, but he's using all of those skills of influence in a way where he's understanding the other side's interests and finding ways to meet their interests. So he's not using these tactics in a way to get what he wants. He's still using them to get or meet the ANC's BATNA, if you will, and also getting the best alternative to not having an agreement, getting the government to see that this was a better alternative to not having an agreement, so at least having some of their interests met, when in fact this was what was being offered was better than not having a negotiated agreement. So as Mandela said, I wanted to see South Africa, or I wanted South Africa to see that I loved even my enemies while I hated the system that turned us against one another. So again, think about that when you're negotiating with aggressive people or negotiating with people who you have strong differences against or with, what the true negotiation is and what you're trying to influence is the outcome that you believe is better than directly thinking that you have to negotiate or that it's really about the person that you're negotiating with. So the next lecture will we'll circle back to the various arguments videos that we've looked at and piece this together, or continue to piece this together in a way that you're using the skills we've learned to influence outcomes and change minds.